All right, well, hi folks. My name's Joe Roy. I'm here tonight with the Conservation Commission. I just figured I'd give a caveat here. As most of you probably know, I am on the select board, but tonight I'm speaking purely as a member of the Conservation Commission. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that anything you hear from me tonight is a Conservation Commission statement and by no means a reflection of the select board. So we're here tonight to talk a little bit about a proposed land use policy for solar systems and energy storage systems. A little background of how we got here tonight. Durham does not have any ordinance pertaining to solar electricity for any sort of utility scale solar. So you can put things on your roof and stuff like that, but there's no ordinance for actually developing solar fields. And the select board had brought up to the planning board that we should explore a ordinance for solar, to just so the planning board has guidance if solar developers show up and want to propose a project. And so the planning board had deferred the starting of this process to the Conservation Commission. And what the Conservation Commission has done is over the last few months gathered information from surrounding towns like Topsom, analyzed different ordinances from other municipalities, and then looked at ordinance language and standards from other states as well to try to develop an ordinance, or at least propose one for the planning board's consideration, and then the planning board can accept that or make modifications and then propose that to the select board, and then from there it can be put onto the ballot for a vote or put onto the votes for the plant as a warrant at the town meeting in April. And so tonight's process is more or less going to be to give some background information and show what has been developed by the Conservation Commission up to this point. And I just want folks to know that this is a rough draft, and the point of this exercise tonight is to solicit feedback. So I don't want anyone to see this and say, oh, that's exactly what they're gonna do and we haven't had a chance to speak on it. This is where we wanna hear things like, I think we should do this, or I think this should be addressed, or I have some concerns about this. So this is really that community portion of it. And we really are ready to put a lot of red ink on anything here and take that back and analyze it and look at legal precedents and things like that, and then make a recommendation to the planning board. So we're hoping that this is a really great two-way conversation. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask. We're also gonna make time towards the end to just have a discussion on these sorts of things and get feedback. So we'll start off. George, are you gonna run the slideshow for us? Cool. All right. So I think I kind of skipped ahead and already started talking about the first slide. But yeah, that's what I have for the introduction.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm George Tavares, the town planner, and I work with the planning board, and I'm also assisting the Conservation Commission with in doing the research and looking at what some of the options are. And I'm also tasked with drafting whatever the policy is and integrating it into the land use ordinance. A lot of communities have a separate ordinance for solar energy systems. What Durham has done for several years is to integrate all of the land use policies into a single ordinance. So what we will be doing, we will be drafting whatever regulatory requirements come out of this process will be put into the land use ordinance, and then the code officer, the planning board, everybody will be aware that those exist and what they contain. So, as I said, we've been working together for about 6-8 months now, and whatever comes out of this process, as Joe said, will go back to the planning board and then on to the select board for potential consideration at the April town meeting in 2024. So just to give you a little bit of background, as Joe said, part of what's driving this is the fact that Durham, unlike most communities in this region, has no standards whatsoever for solar farms. So if a project comes in today, and we've had multiple inquiries about doing projects here in Durham, so the planning board has to rely on some general conditional use criteria. It can do that, it must do that. And then there are site plan review standards, but those really are designed for commercial projects, not for solar or industrial type projects. So that's kind of a weakness in the ordinance. So what this will do is give the planning board with clear guidance for what the issues are related to solar farms, which we're gonna go over tonight. And then what are the regulatory tools that the planning board can use to address potential impacts of a solar farm in Durham. So just to give you all a little bit of background what the Conservation Commission has been looking at, as I said, the purpose of this initial effort on this topic of land use is to establish a clear process for the planning board in reviewing the projects and specific standards that they can apply to those projects. The Conservation Commission has discussed possibly in the future looking at some other issues that other towns have addressed, which would include looking at some areas of the community may not be appropriate for these types of uses and facilities, and then there may be actually optimum places where they should be located. So they will consider doing some additional research on those two tracks. But right now, what we're looking for is to give the planning board some effective tools when a solar farm comes in, that they have what they need to in terms of understanding and can do a proper review of that project and make sure that all of the issues are addressed. So any land use policy and ordinance of the town of Durham should be by main law based on its comprehensive plan. And back in 2018, the town went through a very extensive public participation process and set some specific recommendations for various policies, but also kind of put a vision for what the town wants to be over the next 20, 25 years. And the three major themes that came out of that community effort were, first, to really preserve Durham's rural character. That's what attracts people here, and so that's a very widely held goal for the community, is to protect that rural character. Second, to promote the agriculture and forestry of this community, which is embedded into that rural fabric of the community. And finally, another important goal that came out of the public participation process was to protect Durham's environment. So those were kind of the three overarching goals, and there weren't any specific policies related to solar farms. This is a relatively new phenomenon here in Maine, and so part of it is, like so many communities, they're rushing to get something on the books so that when these major projects come in, they can effectively deal with them.
And just a note on that, that's kind of what has spurred this discussion in Durham, is that we don't have anything, and so nothing feels inadequate. And rather than getting into a position where we're being reactive and having all these proposals coming through, the goal is to develop something with the community right now that meets all of the standards within the comp plan and meets the desires of the community, so we're ready for future projects if they do come to Durham.
So if you do any research on the internet and you look at solar farms, because these things have proliferated so rapidly over the last decade, and it's kind of like cell towers 35 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. Cell towers were popping up all over, and communities were trying to respond to that in a similar fashion. So this is kind of the next wave of technology and development that's occurring. And if you do some Googling on this issue, if you look at like the city of Augusta, if you've driven up the interstate and you go through Augusta, you see all of these solar installations around every one of the interchanges. And there's been kind of a backlash in the community, and they've actually talked about doing a moratorium so that they can develop some proper buffering and those types of issues. And one of the biggest impacts, the most notable on any community, is the visual impacts of these facilities. This is a project up in Pittsfield, Maine. It's the industrial scale. I'm not sure exactly the size of this, but I'm estimating it's probably over 100 acres. And so if you put that in open fields here in Durham, I think people would definitely notice that. So, and you can see with this particular installation, no buffering whatsoever along this. This is in Hinckley, Maine, and that was industrial scale. There's kind of a medium range of these types of projects, and this is community scale. This is on Route 201 in Skowhegan. This community scale system serves the Hinckley School. there's kind of a private school complex there with lots of buildings, and so that school facility program utilizes this solar field for generation of electricity for that facility. And this is one of the issues. It's not just the visual; it's also the glare that comes off of these. So a lot of the communities, like Topsom and others that we've looked at, they have specific standards for using cover materials that will not cause glare, and so that's the type of impact. And also another thing that Maine Audubon in particular has provided some guidance for communities. If these are placed in wildlife corridors, what many ordinances require is a ground clearance in the fencing so that small mammals can pass through unimpeded, as opposed to their historic pattern of travel has been blocked completely. So that's another standard. Invasive species, Joe, you mentioned being out in Montana. I worked in Montana for 5 years, and out there, weed control. They have a weed control district because they have cattle, and it's these poisonous, toxic weeds come in. So developers routinely have to go out and survey for any existing invasive species of plants, and then come up with a mitigation plan for eradicating them. So many communities in Maine are now looking at where what they call scarify, 20 acres of land to make sure that does not, by bringing in materials and equipment, you're not bringing in invasive plant species. So that's another issue. And then stormwater, obviously you're disturbing many acres of land and making sure that the stormwater is appropriately treated. Then another big issue that many towns are looking at, like cell towers, is once they're no longer effective and obsolete, you don't want to have these major infrastructure facilities in the community just abandoned and left there to rust and rot. So most of these communities in their ordinances have what they call a decommissioning plan. And so what they will do is they'll look at, okay, once these panels are no longer effective in producing enough energy to make it cost effective, then there should be a specific plan for removal and recycling of those panels, the racking systems that hold them, the wiring of the whole project, the inverters and the transformer equipment that's associated with one of these facilities, the foundations for those solar array panels, and the fencing, obviously, and then the access roads, and then making sure that whoever the party is that is developing this and whoever purchases it, that they are financially responsible for those costs as opposed to putting that onto the community. So that's usually part of one of these ordinances, what they call a decommissioning plan and a performance guarantee, a financial guarantee to make that has to be kept in place during the life of the facility. Another issue that's come up within the last month or so is we've been contacted by developers of with energy storage systems. And this is a little bit different. They can be associated with a solar farm where they will store the energy that's generated by the solar facility and then release it into the grid, electrical grid. And the state has adopted a goal of really expanding the capacity of storage systems to help balance out the grid during peak times and when there are outages, to try to give that available energy to address any outages in need. So we have actually been contacted by someone to build one of these energy storage systems. And again, the town just does not have the understanding or the tools to effectively deal with these types of facilities. We're still just kind of trying to get our mental arms around what are the issues involved. Some of the research that we've looked at, these types of storage facilities can be very challenging for a fire department, even in an urban setting. So it seems like public water might be a requirement for having one of these in the community and effectively dealing with it, and special training. When these things burn, they can go very hot and can release toxic gases. So does the local Durham Fire and Rescue have the equipment and the training to deal with one of these types of facilities. So those are issues we're just starting to get into, and we're not sure whether this will include some part of energy storage systems, but some of these on some scale are potentially associated with the solar farm, so we have to address it in some form, but we're not exactly sure.
Yeah, and like George had said earlier, is that not all energy storage is tied directly to a energy project like a solar array or a wind farm or something. Some of this would just be to store energy from the grid, build up the battery power during low cost times or low draw times, and then have that so during you have high peak times during the summertime when everyone's AC are on and stuff like that. So they could be completely separate facilities, but like George said, we're considering, because we're working on an ordinance now, trying to fit this all in, so it's a consideration at this point.
It's almost like an electrical substation.
Yeah, and these are mostly currently being located in urban and in industrial sites.
Usually where high voltage lines are already existing.
But anywhere you have a power line, potentially, that is where they're gonna be looking, and we have actually had at least one inquiry for one of these in Durham. So, with all of that background of understanding of what the issues are that the Conservation Commission has been looking at, where we currently are with just a framework for a set of regulations, and we're not gonna provide you with draft ordinance language here tonight. We have some of that in place, but we're still working on it. What we really wanna do is give you the bones of it, the structure of what these ordinance provisions would be. So the first thing is to categorize the different types of systems. And they really are mostly about size, both in terms of the acreage, surface area, but also the voltage. Many communities trying to limit the size of industrial facilities or restrict them to certain parts of the community. Durham, really, it isn't about how much energy is produced, it's about what the size mostly is the primary concern at this point. And Durham's really not talking at this point about putting a size limit on these in terms of a certain, once you go over a certain megawatt capacity, then Durham would not allow that. So what we're really looking at is what is the level of review that would have to occur and the level of permitting. So there are basically three different scales of these things. The first is small. So Joe mentioned panels on your roof. You're seeing more and more of the freestanding on a residential property where it looks like one of those in an industrial, but it's just a small installation. And a lot of home businesses in Durham, small businesses could theoretically have that. So we're looking at that scale to simply have the standard electrical permitting process done through the code enforcement officer. So that's one of the principles. So something with less than 2,000 square feet of surface area could be approved by the code officer. So homeowners or small businesses could do it without having to go to a regulatory board. Medium scale, which we're defining, and different towns have different measurements for how they process these, is somewhere between the 2,000 square feet and 20,000 square feet, which is about a quarter of an acre. We're looking at those, and then one of those might be for a larger business or for a subdivision. There's a kind of a trend right now, what they call net zero, where subdivisions are going in and all the homes are super insulated. They have heat pumps, they have solar panels. So you might have a community or a subdivision where they're creating a half an acre of solar panels to basically generate all the electricity and energy that they need for their subdivision. So that type of a project would go to the planning board as part of the subdivision review, and it would basically, or for a commercial, would be handled by a site plan review, where all they're looking at are the design aspects, buffering and those sorts of things, drainage. For larger than that, anything over a half an acre would be an additional process where the board would look at, okay, anything over a half an acre, a project could come in, could propose 20 acres. We've had at least one of those inquiries. Could be a mega 100, 200 acre of CMP, or one of its, people looking to do something on a larger scale. So that would involve what they call a conditional use review, where the planning board, under those criteria, has to decide, is what is being proposed within the scale and intensity of use that's compatible with what's around it. So obviously, if you're an industrial park, one of these types of large facilities is of the same scale. If it's next to a single-family residence, that's a different matter. So that is so first, before any real big project would go through the design process, the planning board will first say, okay, what is the nature of this project? What is the nature of the location where it's being proposed? And are there just some inherent reasons why this can't be located here from a use standpoint? And then if it says, yes, there's a CMP substation right on the next parcel, like the one on, is it on Poland Road? In Pownell, so there, it may be appropriate to put that there, in some location in Durham. But that would happen first. If the planning board gives it a conditional use permit, then they would go through the detailed design review of that project. So that's kind of the.
Jordan, I'm
Yep,
jumping right here real quick. So before we kind of get into the meat of like a little bit of what the standards would be for these, I just wanted to kind of reiterate, you know, when we looked at this to decide what sort of buckets we wanted to put things in, small, medium, or large, we were really thinking a lot about Durham's rural characteristic, but also being able to still do things like produce your own energy and stuff like that. So that's why we felt it was important to have that kind of, you know, standard code officer enforcement level small projects. So if you want to put them on your roof, or you need to put something small in your backyard to provide for yourself and it's non-commercial, that just is a code enforcement officer permit like it is right now. And then the reason we went with square footage as opposed to megawatts, a lot of times you hear about developments as like their megawatt size, is that we felt that was a little bit more in line with keeping with the rural characteristic. We were thinking more about the visual footprint, and our thought process was, you know, if the community is comfortable with 20,000 square feet, does it really matter how much electricity is being produced off of that footprint? Because panels are getting more and more efficient. Electricity is, these are getting engineered in a way that they can create more with less. So we were saying, well, if we're comfortable with that quarter acre, it doesn't really matter how many kilowatts are.
You're talking.
Oh, can you so I just wanna make a quick note, cause we have the camera on, if people can say their name and their street before they speak, just cause that's usually how we like to have that recorded, that would be awesome.
To Worthington Garrish Road, square footage fenced or panels?
If I remember correctly, it would be within the fence line, correct,
Okay,
George?
because you can fence off a bigger area than you plan to put a farm in.
It would actually be, if you think about a row of solar panels, they're usually at an angle to capture the sun. So what you would do is draw a vertical line in
So you're talking
the
panel
footprint,
surface.
just the
Right, panel
panels,
surface,
cause like you're saying, these have to be spaced apart so that they don't block the sun of each other. And so rather than say, we're gonna count all of that, you're gonna discount the area between the rows.
But that has to be defined somewhere.
It is defined, it will be
Yeah.
defined.
Yeah, so we have the technical language that we're gonna be working on. We have some of it now, and then we'll have those technical standards built in to give to the planning board. But that's a really, really good point. Our last meeting for the Conservation Commission was all about determining technical language and what needs to be put in and what needs to be really detailed. So we wanna make sure when this is developed that all those questions are very clear, so there's no opportunity for developers to take advantage of any sort of loopholes or stuff like that. So we've had folks who work in the permitting of these sorts of things come in and give us some feedback. Other communities come in and give us some feedback. So George probably has a notebook this big of notes that we're working on. And then, like I said, this is just the first of another review. So there'll be another opportunity to get more feedback after that sort of language is really fleshed out. So, but it's a good question.
Hi, John O'Brien. I live at 643 Durham Road. I'm in this at the utility scale in my day job, and we do projects all over the country. I'm actually with I do the advocacy, so I turn people out to events like this.
Mhm.
It's kind of fun to participate in it in my own town, and we see a lot of different ordinances, and like I said, it's just the big ones. It's just if you said 100, 200 acres. We're more at like the 1,000-acre end, but on the side, I also have a project that I'm developing on Durham Road. It's in Brunswick actually, and so I'm dealing with their ordinance, and it's what I would say is small. It's as much as you can put on the single-phase lines, which is 167 kilowatts. I'm actually doing 150 kilowatts, but that that takes up a quarter acre if I squeeze it all together, and that's the most efficient panels, and that's enough for, so 150 kilowatts is enough for 18 households maybe. So if you divide that by 20 to get to your, you're not even necessarily gonna provide enough for one household on that small scale that you have right there. And yeah, so a quarter acre, no, maybe you would be okay with that, but I think that these numbers are a little arbitrary. Like when I see them and I'm thinking, medium, like my project would be in medium. Really the medium to me is the community scale projects on the 3-phase power lines, which are around 2 megawatts, and that's gonna be like your up to 20 acres. And then your large scale, your utility scale is what we call it at work. That's gonna be the ones that tie into the transmission lines, and those are gonna be above 5 megawatts, let's say, but really they're above 50 megawatts. So I would, I know that you're, I get where you're coming from on the rural character, but I would say from somebody that's gonna be applying for a permit, it makes a lot more sense if they're defined a little more clearly from the developer's standpoint. And so I would almost have the tendency to be okay, small is residential or commercial. Say small is feeding your service and not anyone else's service. If it's a business and you use as much as 5 households or 20 households, and it's just one solar array, but it's feeding your business, that should count as the one size, I would think. Maybe not. But then the community scale, I would almost do it by is it on single phase line, or is it on 3-phase line, or is it on transmission line? Those being categories. Maybe, I'm just.
So, you just clarify, you do understand, we're not saying you can't do those larger ones. All we're saying is the level of review that has to be applied to those different sizes. And certainly, if there are suggestions on a different size capacity or justification for saying, oh, you don't need to have a site plan review for that, buffering isn't gonna be a concern, or fencing, those types of requirements, until you get up to a 20 acres, there's no visual concerns. I'm not sure that's necessarily what the Conservation Commission and public in Durham would think, but you can certainly make any suggestions, and you're more than welcome, especially from someone with your expertise.
Yeah, and we'll still be working on this in the Conservation Commission, so if this is the first you're seeing of this, and you wanted to attend a meeting, we make time for people to give feedback. If you have technical language that you think we should consider, that's a good time for that as well. But like George said, this isn't saying that you can't do those, it's just saying at what point a certain different permit kicks in. Cause right now, rooftop is just, the code enforcement officer signs off on it. But for everything else, we don't have any language at all, so it's kind of like a nominal fee, and then the planning board's kind of like, we don't know if this meets standards, we don't know if this needs a soil and erosion control plan. So that it would still be, everything would still be potentially allowable, but we'd have standards at that point. So that's kind of what this is for.
It's restrictive. I mean, it basically says that anything over half an acre is gonna need a site plan review.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that was intentional because of trying to
Mhm.
keep a rural character to the town.
But, yeah, but there's
But
still
it's
an
not that,
application
it's not that you
process.
can't do anything over half an acre, it's just there's a site plan review associated with it.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
a little
yeah,
bit?
Brunswick, it's, there's a couple different flags, it's like, I think if it's commercial, then that's one thing, if it's just for your own, then that's another category, but then also, if it's over a quarter acre,
Mhm.
then it requires a major site plan review.
Mhm.
If it's under, it doesn't, and then if it's over something else, then it needs a conditional use permit.
Mhm. Yeah.
So the same principles that we're following.
I haven't seen past this slide, but
Yeah.
it sounds like it.
Yeah.
Good, Christian.
Phyllis Brannon at Brookside Drive. So are you just considering solar and not wind farms?
Yeah, this is purely a solar ordinance, and I think that the reason that the direction came down for us to focus on the solar ordinance is just the prevalence and the speed that these are going up at. And when you get into wind development, it's inherently at a larger scale that triggers state level permits that a lot of smaller scale, utility scale solar, doesn't. So this is kind of like, when you're driving around the state and you're seeing a lot of these like 20 or less acre projects pop up, there, for a lot of those, it's not triggering a high level state permit, so it's falling on the local municipality, and sometimes that's inadequate, so that's why we're just focusing on solar with this, so, but thank you for asking.
Yep.
So do we have any other questions before we kind of move into some of the meat and
Yes.
potatoes here? Yep.
Russ Cole, 71 Gloucester Road. Can you clarify what acreage difference is between small and medium? You said quarter, but
So
you
an
said
acre
half.
is 43,000 square feet,
Mhm.
Okay,
so, 20,000 square feet is just under half an acre.
Mhm. Yeah, so I guess we're putting up square feet here
yeah,
rather than acreage,
I understand, yep.
but really what you'll understand, and kind of like what this gentleman said here, is for us large, some people would still call that pretty small.
Right.
Cause they would say over 20,000 square feet, that's not very large, but that was deliberate, just to say that is where it would kick in, the planning board conditional use permit and the site.
Okay, we'll continue
Thank
on
you.
with some others, just the guidelines for the standards that we're developing. And this just, I forgot to show you the different, what I stated verbally, the code officer would do the small, planning board site plan review for the medium, and then an additional conditional use review process for the larger ones. So submission requirements, this list of things that they would have to provide to the planning board would only apply to the medium and the large, it would not be the home-based or small business based. So this list would mirror the requirements in operation and maintenance plan for this facility. A lot of times these things just sit out there and there's nobody around. So making sure that it's properly maintained electrically, in terms of the vegetation management, those sorts of things, they need to submit a operation and maintenance plan. The energy system specifications have to be provided, and along with that, a certification from qualified professionals that this installation that they're proposing meets all safety codes. Also certification of the requirements of the Maine Public Utilities Commission and CMP, the infrastructure that they're gonna be connecting into. They've got to obviously meet all of those standards, and the planning board will want to make sure that they've gone through all of their required permissions from those different agencies. Emergency services plan for the fire chief, and so they would have to get the fire, one community, actually, they bought some special fire apparatus for the local fire department because they just didn't have the capacity to deal with it. And that would not just be for fire, it would also be if people are out there working on it, electrical problems, they could be called out there for rescue as well. And they need to be able to get into the facility for one thing, And also, if there's, you know, a fire or something, like a brush fire that's going on, coming toward it, they have to be able to, access it to shut it off. So those are the types of emergency services plan. Visual impact assessment by a landscape architect. As we indicated, for a lot of communities that are having a lot of public input on these things, people are very concerned with the visual impacts. And rather just having a simplistic buffering, you know, showing circles on a plan, this really requires someone who's trained to do landscape architecture, look at what are the views of this facility going to be from the neighbors, from public roads, and determine where buffering is required, and then design it to make sure, number one, it's going to be effective, and then number two, that it's gonna be lasting. And is it gonna be, you know, kind of an artificial arborvitae hedge, or is it gonna be a naturalized landscape buffer to have it kind of fit into the character of the neighborhood? And that's where a landscape architect comes in to be able to give the applicant as well as the planning board a qualified opinion of what really makes sense for this particular project. And along with that, would be the
I have a
I'm
comment,
sorry.
actually. So in, the fossil fuel industry, it's really common that corporations form LLCs. And when it comes time to decommission your gas well in Pennsylvania, they just bankrupt the LLC and walk. So, states like Pennsylvania require bonding.
Yes, that's on the list.
Okay.
We'll get to there.
Good.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
the vegetation management plan would look at, in addition to invasive species like we talked about before, it would also be the vegetation management plan for that buffer to make sure that it's gonna last and be taken care of. And then the decommissioning plan, which is what you just referenced, and a financial guarantee. So basically, most towns that do this are now requiring that they provide a performance guarantee, a financial guarantee. It has to be maintained for the perpetuity of the facility, and updated every 5 years with a new estimate. And then finally, a public outreach program. So, part of the reason for sending everything to the planning board of any significant scale is to give the neighbors an opportunity to, you know, talk about what this project is gonna be, where it's gonna be, and what the potential impacts on them are gonna be. You know, if you have a farm, chairman of the planning board, John Talbot, is taught, you know, he's on, Stackpole Road, right? Yeah, and, you know, he's next door, he's near a power line, and he's trying to envision a solar farm of 20 acres, 100 acres, or whatever, what that's gonna do to his views. It's not that they should be able to say you can't do it because it's gonna impact, but they should have some input into saying, okay, yeah, I do wanna see some landscaping. And so, in some of the communities that are, some of the developers of these solar farms, if you've been in Pennsylvania, there's a project down there where one of these companies is to get landowners to let them do the projects. They're selling the landscaping, and they're telling this farmer that, you know, you're gonna have a nice facility when it's done. So that public outreach plan is also part of the potential requirements. And then the actual performance standards. So that was all about what documents do they have to submit, what types of plans. The standards would require 100-foot property line setback.
George,
Yeah.
before we go into performance standards, did anyone have questions about submission requirements? What some of these words might mean up here, or whether they think it's an inadequate list, or there should possibly be things removed? Any feedback on that? We can come back to it again later, but I figured we'd just take a brief moment to solicit feedback on this slide, if anyone had.
Well, I was thinking about some of these things as they came up there and thinking, could I do my project with these in
Mhm.
place at a 1/4 acre scale? And I would probably not choose Durham to do a small, what I think is a small one, but it fits into medium. And then when number 1 came up on the next slide, then it's like, that's a killer. Like I'm not, I have not that clearance around the edges. And I don't know, it's kind of a shame, but I think that it skews the projects toward the, like, larger, I would almost say, like, if it's on three-phase line, that would be, to me, a large community scale project. And then like the single phase line ones, you're really, I mean, the margins are so tight there, it's hard to make it work as it is. And any more hurdles, they're just, I don't see it happening. But, you know, if you want the bigger ones and you don't want the smaller ones, or, I don't know, it's just, it would be tough with these rules.
What do you want to encourage as opposed to discourage?
So you said a quarter acre, your project is a quarter acre?
Yeah.
It's small,
Yeah.
right? So that would count as small, and you're saying,
If
That's
they
the
were
same
to
thing
have
with
100 foot
10,000 square
setback,
feet.
and then maybe buffering in addition, you have no place to put
so
it.
it sounds to me like what you're saying is that these requirements kind of kill the middle category.
The medium in this, in this classification.
Because yours could be almost twice as big
Yep,
and
yep.
still be small.
Because a quarter acre would be 10,000 square feet, so that would put that, your project would fall in the median, which is between 2,000 and 20.
Oh,
Yeah, I almost think like,
Got it.
these might make sense for large, but the medium is so small, in my opinion, here, that why would the large, you know, cause we're talking even 1,000 acre one has the same rules as a tenth of an acre one, when you categorize the medium and large together right here.
So I'm taking notes here, I just wanna make sure I encapsulate your comment well. It sounds like what you're kind of advocating for is that width from the bucket for medium should be larger than what we're suggesting.
I think the minimum size on medium should be higher,
Yeah,
and,
cause the standards would be the same for both.
Yeah.
and then to
Okay.
treat both medium and large the same in these two slides.
Yeah, so back to the issue of the
That's good
100-foot
feedback.
setback. On the 100-foot setback, just understand, that would be for the panels to the property line. Then they would have the fencing outside that, and then they would have the 50-foot buffer. So the 50-foot buffer and the fencing would be within the 100-foot setback, just to clarify.
Okay, they're within it, okay.
Not
So
in-
it's not
in
cumulative,
addition to it.
yeah.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah, Phil.
So who incurs the cost for any one of those bullets?
The applicant.
The
Yeah.
applicant? Okay.
Totally.
Yeah, and so that's one thing that we made sure that this was gonna be, you know, standards in here, so when the applicant is applying, if there's a service that the town is going to need to get, like a third-party reviewer or something like that, that's falling on the applicant to provide for that, so it's not costing the town money to evaluate in that way.
You're also ensuring that the person wanting to create this is well financed. That's subtly there.
Yeah, that's one of the criteria for conditional use, is they have to prove financial and technical capacity. So, 100-foot setback for the equipment itself. Limits on topsoil removal, you know, if you have a 20-acre site, you wanna make sure they don't go in and farm off all the topsoil, remove all of that. And again, they can have a plan that shows what they're gonna do. Invasive species survey before and after construction, and a mitigation plan if they discover that they've created it. Mitigation of surface glare from panels is another standard that will be included potentially. 8-foot agricultural style security fencing with the ground clearance for smaller mammals. And if you look around at some of the facilities in the area, you'll see there's really no consistency in the type of fencing that they're doing. Some have very robust chain link fences with anti-crawl guards, some just have what looks like just a 4-foot high fence around it. So this would call for security purposes an 8-foot, but have it be an agricultural design as opposed to an industrial chain link fence. Maximum solar array height of 15 feet. The 50-foot vegetative buffer outside the security fencing where it's needed per a visual impact analysis. Particularly focusing on roads and neighbors, And having the planning board have discretion on where those buffers are required. And they can even reduce the width of a buffer if it makes sense in a particular location. Say you have an access road that's going to it. And then to require all utilities to be placed underground except where above ground is required by the utility companies.
And so we have another slide of standards that we're gonna continue on to, so numbers 10 through 19 after this. But I wanna take a quick moment like we have on the other slides here and stop here if there's any questions about this sort of stuff. Name and road.
Yeah, Juliet Kaplinger, Royalsboro Road. 100-foot setback, that's from the fence
No,
to,
from the property line to the panels or inverters, any of the equipment of the facility. So you have a 100-foot setback, then there's gonna be clearance to the fence, which might be, how, 10 feet?
so,
20 feet? So,
so you could have your panels, I mean, you could have your inverters in the middle of the project.
Yep.
And only require 100 feet
Well,
from those inverters?
It would be from any of the equipment associated with the project, so
So
the panels or the inverter,
No,
but
the
not
fence
the
would
fence.
not.
The fence is exempt from that.
yeah, it would just be from the generating equipment.
Okay,
Your
So the
inverter's gonna
panels-
be as close to the power lines as you can get,
yeah,
because
depending
of the
on,
distance lost.
so it could be the edge of the panels then? To the property line would be 100 feet
That's
or
right,
so, okay.
that's right.
Probably like the closest thing to that parcel edge, 100 feet. Okay.
Then the fencing and the buffering can go closer.
And so some of the things we wanted to just point out here is where the reason we came on some of these, so for example, like limiting of topsoil removal. Once topsoil is removed and you have kind of lower quality soils left behind, those are more likely to promote invasive species in terms of vegetation, so we wanna make sure we're keeping the topsoil intact there. Invasive species surveys, we thought that was a really important component to add in before construction and after. There are a lot of invasive plant species on the landscape, so there could be a proposed project that's proposing to take place where there are already invasive plant species. In those cases, we're not necessarily saying the applicant should have to remove everything before, but at the same time, we wanna make sure that the activities of the project don't increase the prevalence of invasive plant species. So if they're bringing in their own fill or bringing in equipment that ends up having seeds from invasive plants on it that is established after the project's created, it would be on them to come up with a post-construction monitoring and potentially removal program for that.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please do.
The other reason for the topsoil limitation is that when you have that decommissioning plan, you're really looking for that site to be restored to its original condition. So if they've taken off 20 acres of topsoil, and then it's left with a gravel pad, that's gonna be there for perpetuity.
Yeah.
So part of the reason to not allow them to mine the topsoil is for the future decommissioning of the project.
Yeah, exactly. And so we said 8-foot agricultural style fencing, just because we're thinking a lot about the visual impacts of these, and it's kind of funny to think about what we want our fence to look like if there's going to be a wall of panels behind it. You might not be concerned about the visual, but we're thinking that something that has a more agricultural style fencing, kind of like what you might see around like a pen with cattle. Kind of that blocky type fencing with wooden posts would be a better fit. And then with that clearance underneath, so the fence won't come directly to the ground, to allow things like small mammals to move in and out. Yes?
Visual,
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna have to define that pretty specifically, because my version of looking at something is different from your version of looking at something, and her position looking at it is different than my position looking. It's a sticky one.
Yeah.
It's gonna require
And
lots of,
we've talked a lot about that because like one of the examples of the slides that George showed earlier where there was the fencing and you start thinking about like 100 foot is not very far in terms of a visual buffer. So if you're like, oh, it's gonna be 100 feet from the road, so it's gonna be buffered. Not really, you're gonna see it just fine. And so that's where we were talking about the use of some of these, what did you call it here? Visual impact assessments by the architecture, and some examples that George has shown at some of our meetings where like these cross sections where they're establishing a tree community and a shrub community between the road and between the panel array and stuff like that. Because I think we've all driven by projects where they're right up against the road and they're pretty visually obstructive to some folks. And we've driven by other projects where there's a full forest and they left a 300-foot buffer, and so you can barely see panels in the background. Or they're on the back, like over on Leeds Junction Road, heading to Leeds. It's on the backside of a hill. You only know it's
The
there.
one going to Lewiston,
Yeah,
up
up on the
there.
hill behind there. It's
You
like
barely notice it.
exactly. So if once the construction equipment's gone, people might drive by and never notice it. And so our thought process is like, projects you don't see are the best ones, you know. And so that's why we wanted to have a little bit of you know, ability for the planning board to have some standards, but then also make some calls in there. Is like, does this fit that neighborhood? Does this fit those standards?
And is it up to one person to decide this? In other words,
No.
You've contracted a person that's gonna do landscaping, with his view.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is some research from Quarryville, Pennsylvania, and big, you know, Lancaster area, big, agricultural community, tourism is huge, so they're very concerned with visual impacts of these things. And as I said, the solar companies that are going into this area really want to be able to do their projects, so they're approaching the community and saying, look, landscaping is gonna be part of this. So this is, you know, the developers are approaching this from this standpoint. And so here's an example of a project in Quarryville where they went before the community and the planning board and put in the visual buffer designed by a landscape architect. And so they, as part of their submission to the planning board, will provide a landscaping plan and again, prepared by a qualified landscape architect. And the planning board will be able to hire a peer reviewer, someone independent, that can look at that and say, yes, these plants are appropriate for this location, or no. You know,
Yeah.
getting some dwarf junipers from Walmart is not really gonna cut it. And then, so the way ultimately it'll be the planning board that'll make the decision based on the input of the experts and considering comments from the neighbors and the public. So it will be somewhat, you can't eliminate all subjectivity, but at the same time, you can't have a precise design that you impose on everybody going into this, because you need some design flexibility. So this will require well-prepared plans by people who know what they're talking about, and then the planning board will process that with public input and come to the final design. That's how it works.
And so with this example here, like what we really like about this that George has shown is like, this is a well-developed plan done by a professional. They're showing an aerial footage of what things look like, literally showing pictures of what the species that are planted are, showing the buffer, and then showing a side array here and how, you know, these shrubbier species are gonna be planted in between trees and stuff like that. And so that's what we're really looking for. But like what George had said is like, it would be really hard for us to recommend an ordinance that said you will establish a visual buffer 6.5 feet tall within 3 years, because you get into things like soil characteristics and site characteristics. So then it's just making sure that there's an understanding that a robust buffer is expected, and that there's language in there so that the planning board can use that to defend a decision when they're telling someone, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can, or no, you have to do more. And so we think that this could be something that could help with those sorts of things. And to the point earlier, with there being assurances from the applicant that they're providing the ability for us to then have the planning board hire someone else to certify whether this passes the straight face test or whether it's actually applicable, much like with our developments when we have, you know, another engineering firm reviewing the firm's work. So.
And this is the type of view analysis that the landscape architect would do and the planning board and the neighbors could see to show what the issues and effectiveness of the buffer is gonna be. So that's the type of analysis that would go into that issue.
Yeah, and that kind of, it's like, this is where we're saying that we want those standards to be broad enough to allow the planning board to make those decisions, because like in the example, like heading to Lewiston, like, do you need to establish that huge, robust vegetative buffer if it's gonna be most on the backside of a hill anyways, you know? And so we don't want it to be so restrictive that you can't apply our standards, but we wanna make sure that there are standards, so you can have some flexibility there.
I think that those requirements on the landscape designer coming in, are also way too much for, what you're considering a medium project to deal with. Because even a big house or a business, just for themselves, is gonna fall into that category. And they're gonna say, well, I guess I can't cover my whole bill, and I'm just gonna have to put some on my roof or whatever, because I can't afford to go through these steps. And I also think that, you know, like the best solar project is the one you can't see. You know, you know, we don't like seeing multi-acres or hundreds of acres especially, of glass compared to grass or forest. But, you know, a medium project that's only a tenth of an acre in this case, maybe, is, like, why is that worse than a house or a pole barn? You know, and do we require houses and pole barns to have 100-foot setbacks and arborvitae or whatever, screening? You know, it's like, are the solar farms getting picked on a little bit here? It just seems, you know, like they're getting more scrutiny. Although I would say your 100-foot, if a utility scale project comes in here, they're gonna love you for that rule. 100 feet is nothing for them. So I've seen, where they'll do it based on whether it's a road that they're up against, that's less, like you can go real close to a road versus, you know, a neighboring property, and especially they'll do like a setback from a house on that property, like you've gotta be 300 feet or so, and that's even workable, 300, so if we're talking on the 1,000-acre scale, like that's nothing, that's real easy.
Just finding ground.
Yeah, but I think that you bring a good point. So when the question you asked about like why is one thing allowed to go in without certain buffers or the other, and that's at the will of the community, and so that's why we have this community process where we get that sort of feedback, because it's a fair question. You know, why do small houses not have a different standard than large houses? So we totally understand it, and that's why we're here. As you can see, we're taking notes on this stuff, so that's really good feedback. I also appreciate the feedback there talking about the concerns with the buffer being small for utility scale too. I noted that as well, so.
I'd say the height of 15 feet is doable on, community scale where they're connecting to distribution lines, but the guys that are connected into the utility scale lines, under transmission lines, those projects it's pushing 15 feet. I've seen ordinances up to 25 feet max. If they're using bigger panels and if they're doing what's called 2-panel on portrait orientation with single axis trackers, I know I'm getting kind of.
No, I understand what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, if they're doing 2-panel on portrait and they're 60 degrees, those ones are gonna be above 15 feet. So, you know, that's not the majority right now, but I think it's gonna get to that. And, the taller means the wider the aisles, because they have to space them out, and that's gonna enable agrivoltaics easier, so it's combining agriculture and solar, because you've got more ground in between equipment that you can run, you know, machinery through if you're gonna do mechanized farming. So that would actually improve your agricultural priority, I would say. I mean, it is gonna be a little bit more visually instructive, but I mean, I don't know, there's a property rights thing here too. It's like, you know, can I not put up what I wanna do on my property because these rules? It's kinda like, it's a little suffocating, but I know, I get it. You gotta have a balance. So.
You have the
Well, we
question of trackers too, they're tall, look at the 3 in Brunswick. Going
Those
to
are
Brunswick
jumbos,
now.
yeah.
I mean, we picked
They set you back a little bit when you look at it.
Yeah.
we picked the 2,000 square feet for personal use because we thought, you know, that can fit roughly a 40 to 50 kilowatt system, and the average household is, 7 to 8, so that's, 5 or 6 times what the average house would use. It seemed adequate. I mean,
Yeah.
we could talk about increasing that, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we found that, because it's like, for full disclosure, Michael and I both have solar panels on our roofs, and my roof is 30 foot by 20 or something like that, and it's 10, I think it's 10 kilowatt hour, 10 kilowatt system on there.
About that.
And so we definitely like are hearing on the property right side of things, like definitely want to be able to produce your own electricity. And if you don't have a south-facing roof, or you don't have a good angled roof, we want you to be able to put that array on the ground to meet your needs. Where we get into things getting more complicated, like everything with land use is when you start getting into like that income generating, like when you start, because when you're talking a little bit about, well, it seems like there are different rules here, like there are also different rules for like businesses that are based out of your home and things like that too. So that's why it feels like this second level is coming in here, because this is kind of now an income generating type thing, and it kind of gets binned into something differently than, just a home or agriculture. And that's based off of, what our comprehensive plan has kind of guided us for as well. But all really good stuff. I really appreciate your point about the tracking panels. And you figure when they're making that full sweep and reaching the peak of their angle, they might be higher than that. So there may be some validity in looking at a standard that says, maybe the foot height difference could be different for the tracking panels. As for like the width, the higher panels and the width for, I think you said it was agrivoltaics or, I think that with things like that, I think it's a great idea to open up those opportunities. But like I've heard people say, like, there's not nearly enough sheep to graze all the ground in between panels right now. So that might leave it open for that, but without a plan, I would hate to see, we have these huge tall panels with these super wide areas, and we said it's okay because someone might farm it, and then that never really happens. So like, that's the other side of the coin too there. So, but all good stuff to consider. And like we were saying earlier, like, feel free to also come to a meeting and share any of this via email or anything like that, because this is really good feedback. So.
And someone with your expertise is really helpful to the process. Just to kind of look at it and give this type of feedback, it's very helpful. Because Julie will do it for the commission as well. Okay, going on, lighting minimized and shielded. 400-foot setback from residences for noise generating equipment. We were kind of talking about a similar approach. Access and contact information posted for the fire department emergencies. High voltage warning signs posted. Facility to be well maintained and free of hazards, so that if code officer or fire department goes out and does inspections and they see problems, the ordinance gives them the ability to legally post a notice of violation and deal with it. Minor modifications can be approved by the code officer. Any substantial changes would have to go back to the planning board, but it does allow some flexibility, if they have to move an inverter or add an inverter, those types of minor changes, the code officer could approve those without sending them back to the board. Code officer to be notified of ownership changes of the facility, and with that, the new owners have to provide written acknowledgement of all the requirements that they have to meet. Any breach of approval of the performance, the financial guarantee would be cause for basically determination of a breach of their approval, and the town could order them to stop operations until they come back into compliance. And then finally, a time limit for the decommissioning and enforcement of that. So those are the areas that we've looked at for standards, and as Joe said earlier, we've looked at a lot of different ordinances and picked from some and picked from others to get the best package that we can come up with, and we're still in the drafting stage, but wanted to bring out this is the framework that the town is looking at, and get some public input on that before we go any further.
Julia?
Yeah, what is the definition of the noise generating equipment?
What noise does it generate?
Yeah, like would it,
Inverters hum.
like would it be a
Oh.
tracker? Cause some trackers make a little bit of noise.
Yeah, a little bit, I guess.
Do we have a defined like, decibel level for what's considered noise in there?
Well, there are decibel limits, I
Yeah.
think, but in terms of defining which equipment, we'll have to look, see whether we have specific wording.
That's a good point though.
Again, these are
because-
just descriptions, these
Yeah.
are not the technical language.
But that's a good point
Okay.
to look for that, cause even high voltage lines, like when I walk under them, I hear a hum, but only when I'm right underneath them. And so, you know, coming up with a standard, I think is important
But
there.
the comprehensive plan does have language already about noise. So we want those two,
To be a
our ordinance and the comprehensive plan language to be consistent.
And this was what was in some of the other ordinances.
Mhm.
They had, the one in Stafford, Virginia, they had a 400
Might be
foot
in the
setback to all
definition
vehicles.
section.
It is.
And again,
I think it's 60
the
decibels.
consultants are gonna have qualified people there to answer planning board questions. Town can have a peer reviewer to say, yes, that generates a lot of noise, you have to be careful about that. That is okay, so the planning board will have some discretion on all of these issues. Okay, other questions on these performance standards?
I have another one.
Yeah.
Would you mind going back to, I think it's the first part one, no, part two, sorry. The, number 10, public outreach plan, like what that would entail?
Yeah, typically they would explain to the planning board what they have done to reach out to the neighbors. And then they would have that presentation. They obviously have to do, neighbor notifications as part of the process for either site plan review or for conditional use review. But I think this is really calling for a little bit more than that, to say, go out and meet with the neighbors and hear what their concerns are, and then come back and report to the planning board what you've actually come up with. In terms of how you're gonna address some of those concerns in advance, rather than waiting till the public meeting, neighbors come in and start complaining, and then you have to deal with it. It's much more effective from the development community standpoint to go and meet with the neighbors first. And then you know, if you're coming in and you have a difficult time from someone, you try to meet there, but some people you can't. But at least the planning board will know you made the effort, and the process will be that much farther along. That's what we think.
Something. And one other
So,
que-
I was just gonna say, so in our, land use ordinance, it looks like noise limits generally mean, 45 decibels from 7 PM to 7 AM and 55 decibels from 7 AM to 7 PM, so we would probably make sure that our ordinance adopted something in line of like, breaking that threshold would be considered a noise producing,
At what distance?
yeah, I gotta read what the distance is
Okay,
here.
there is a distance.
Yeah, so if it isn't, this says shall be measured at least 4 feet above ground at the property boundary or
Yes,
source.
generally at the property line.
Yeah, and so we would definitely
If it goes
make,
beyond the property line.
we'll definitely
you're
make
an
sure
issue.
that anything would either defer to our existing ordinance or be explicitly defined. And this is kinda like what George was saying with our ordinances, it's kind of all getting tied into one land use plan as opposed to a separate ordinance, and so we just gotta make sure that's all codified, but it's definitely something we'll go through meticulously.
I have one other thing, I think, so all of these standards that we've gone through, are for both medium and large.
Correct.
And the difference between the medium and large is the medium just has site plan review and the large has conditional use and site plan.
It's also correct.
Okay. They have the same standards,
Yep,
just two
same
different.
performance standards,
Yep,
but two different types of review.
got it.
Okay, we can come back to any of this, but just in terms of the next steps in the process, the Conservation Commission has reviewed the research and is continuing to do that and take the public input, and then we'll make a recommendation to the planning board on a policy. That will happen, later this month, first of next month. Then the planning board will review that draft. They're also working on a housing policy, housing density, based on that new state affordable housing law. So the planning board has been working on that part of it while the Conservation Commission is looking at solar. So the planning board will review, they've pretty much wrapped up their work on the, housing policy. And then, they look at what the Conservation Commission has done on the, solar, and then we'll, review that and decide if they are comfortable moving forward to the select board with a recommendation for land use ordinance amendments for the town meeting. And so then the select board will look at that by the end of January and determine, if they're comfortable with moving forward with the recommendations for the housing density as well as the solar. Then if approved by the select board, they put it on the draft warrant articles that are sent out in the town report in February. And then the amendments would be, formal amendments would be posted for public review during that same time frame. And then the planning board, under Maine law, is required to hold a formal public advertised public hearing, no more than 30 days before the town meeting and no less than 7 days before the town meeting. And then there will be a vote on these amendments on April 6th. That's the process.
Yep.
That gets our ducks in a row, and then the state's gonna come up with a whole different set of things and lay them down on top of us after we get organized.
Well, the nice thing is
Do they or do they not?
so with this city of Maine, we're a home rule, home law rule, home rule authority, so the local municipality is the first step in the regulatory land. So if our standards exceed the restrictions of the state in reference to this, we can still utilize our standards. So if the state of Maine comes in and says, you know, no, this is you need at least a 50-foot buffer, and ours says 100, like, we're good there. So it is designed to allow those local municipalities to really craft ordinances that work for
You're
them.
more apt to change your small, medium, and large
Mhm.
definition, and all of a sudden that.
But as we saw with the housing density,
Mhm.
the state, law does preempt local authority.
In those
So
sorts
they
of,
could come in and say, look, we really need solar, you can't require some of these things that you're requiring. That's what they did with the housing density.
Mhm.
You can't require larger lot
Yeah.
sizes, those sorts of things. So it's just the way it is.
Yeah,
And
there's
that's why
always,
you have a state legislature and
Yeah.
representatives.
and there's
There's
always.
a thought to put behind this.
Yeah. And so our thought process with the ordinance though is that we would rather have something crafted for the future versus nothing, cause right now it's, I think it'd be a $250 fee and kinda do what you want.
Wing it.
You know, and so we wanna avoid that. And so what I wanted to point out here though, is just so everyone understands, like, we're before this step, so we're getting feedback right now from people. Most everything you see here is open for the public, and there is a public comment period in any of this. So if you give feedback tonight, and then the Conservation Commission makes a recommendation to the planning board, and you don't like what was recommended, you can make public comment during the public comment period at the planning board meeting to raise your concerns. Then you can come to the select board meeting, that's open for public comment, and you can raise your concerns there. And then once it's approved and the articles are sent out and everything's ready for public review, this last public, meeting is really just explaining what the ordinance means. So at that point, the warrant language is kinda set in stone, and that's what's gonna be voted at. So at that last meeting, it's more of, you know, can you explain this? Can you, what would this mean? What would that mean? But leading up to that is still where there's the public input point, like we're having tonight. So just letting you all know that you can continue to share public input through essentially like and February, really. So just want everyone to know that it's not just like speak now, forever hold your peace. There's a lot to digest here. There's other meetings you can watch and come up with questions, and you can always email recommendations to the Conservation Commission or the Planning Board as well. So, and especially with some of this stuff, like we will say, like it gets into the weeds with technical language, and so especially if you have expertise in it and you can send a recommendation like, this is what I think some technical language should look like, or here's some technical concerns I have, more than welcome to send that along for consideration.
Will the draft ordinance be on the town website at all for review, or?
Well, whatever goes to the planning board will be posted, their packet every month is posted, so whatever goes to the planning board in, for their January meeting, which is January 3rd, will be posted on the website, assuming you folks are ready to go.
Okay, what about storage?
Yes. Okay, so as I said, this draft that we've got so far only mentions storage in the definition of solar energy systems. And I think the intent of that is to say it would include, the storage systems that are associated with a solar, energy. This draft that we've got so far does not address storage systems separately.
Cause you have to lake size in storage.
That's right.
I mean, it's all over the
That's
board
right.
at this
Several
stage.
different
But
types.
that which is attached to the,
Yeah, that's all we've looked at and all we've covered so far, and not a lot of detail on that part of it. Theoretically, the emergency services plan has to be approved by the fire chief, so they could look at those potential fire hazard aspects of it and advise the planning board, get a consultant to, advise them on those issues, so
you could
We don't have
put the
as much-
utilities commission in it too.
we don't have as much specifics on energy storage systems at this point, but we're trying to put something together.
So are we saying that this ordinance would include or, allow for storage with the PV, or
Yes,
no?
at this point it does.
But all that would meet the standards here, but if a standalone storage project came in, I don't know.
It would, then it would be right where it is now, which they
Yeah.
can come in now. And it would only be addressed by the conditional use
Mhm.
as well as the, site plan review standards. However, as the planning board is looking at that, they would look to some of this language to
Mhm.
see what are appropriate standards for these types of facilities. Wouldn't be as strong as you have it right in your ordinance, and a lot of this is the town able to defend its decisions? So either a developer comes in and is denied their permit, and so they go to court to challenge the planning board decision, or the developer gets their approval and neighbors sue to stop the project. So having all of these types of specific standards helps you when you get into a court situation, as opposed to just general, subjective criteria. That's much harder to defend a decision in either direction.
That's
That's
why
why,
we're here.
that's why we're here.
I don't think that you can put the medium and large in the same set of standards. I think they need to be separated. I think that the medium size is too small and too restrictive. And I think that the large size is not restrictive enough. Things like buffers, setbacks, things like that. But also, in the large, you need to allow for industrial type equipment. So, for instance, the 15-foot height, in that case, is too restrictive. And that, and I think that our friend there is correct, that you're pushing everything either into small or large by doing it this way.
Do you have, and you don't have to answer this now, do you have?
Well, I just
any-
made all that up, I don't know.
No, it's all right. No, this is what this is for. Right? This is all about getting this sort of information here. Do you, if you think of a recommendation in terms of what you think the threshold for sizes should be?
So, I think that the thresholds are really based on how much energy you can produce, not the square footage. And so, you already said that, you based the 2,000 square feet on plenty of capacity for personal use, home use. And that it doesn't sound like you really have a good answer for the medium size. Like what, say, a home business that had, so like, the guy that does welding, what his kind of needs would be, if he were gonna try to power his business with solar. And that you need better information on that, and maybe you have a kind of an answer for that.
Yeah, my recommendation for the thresholds would be so you're requiring a bunch of, your interconnection proof, or your proof that you're good with the utility regulator, right? So that was, I thought, one of the criteria. So I would say for the small, I would require that they present their interconnection or their net billing agreement that proves that it's just one household. And if it's just one service, 1 meter's, power, you know, if the project is just for a single service, that counts as small. And if it's for multiple, but it's still just on single phase, that's gonna be under quarter acre, and I think, or roughly, so I would almost say like quarter acre and below, or, and stipulate that it's more than one, service that you're providing for. That's category 2, let's say. And then.
Okay, so, but what if you have a home business that has a pretty large energy requirement?
I think if it's just one, then that's the lowest.
So, but I think that doesn't meet what it is that the town's trying to accomplish by limiting size.
If it's just one and under a quarter acre, maybe.
Right.
But a quarter acre is a little bigger than, I mean, it's quite a bit bigger than what your small is. But I'd almost break it into 4 though. If it's serving just one unit, one service, under a quarter acre, that's level 1. If it's, multiple and is on single phase, that's level 2. If it's multiple and on 3 phase, that's gonna be up to like 2 megawatt or 5 megawatt, 20 acres. That would be 3, and then utility scale would be 4, which is on like the transmission lines, but it's, I don't know acre wise, so.
Yeah, so, just for clarification here, our medium size is up to 20,000 square feet, which is a half acre. And so when we are talking about that medium size, the idea there would be that would capture, regular old homes, whether they're just or if a home's running a business, or if it's let's say a 10-house subdivision that wants to produce enough electricity for itself. And, you know, we're basing that off of the fact that, you know, our understanding is that, you know, if just the panels that I have on my roof cover my house, and that's, you know, we're in the several hundred square feet, you extrapolate that out for most homes, and that would cover that. And the reason we left that in medium is because we're saying, like, it's not just the one home, but it might be, you know, the mechanic or a farm that has drawing a little bit more needs and stuff like that. So that's why we went up to that 20,000 square foot. And I understand, we had a long discussion about talking acreage versus kilowatt hours, or kilowatts, or power output. And the reason we were really coming back to acreage is because of the visual aspect. We felt like that is what meets more so with the town's desire to have that rural characteristic, but that if all of a sudden tomorrow a new panel comes out that's twice as efficient, we shouldn't tell that developer, oh, now you can only put half as many panels up because you've created efficiency, the marketplace has provided more efficiency, you can't capture that, we want you to limit your footprint size. If you invent a panel tonight that's cranking out twice as much power, we still want you to be able to be allowed to put that half acre of panels up and not get punished for having more efficiency. So that's kind of why we went with the acreage there. And then we also thought about, for the future, for decommissioning or for repowering, if someone puts up their panels and then great efficiencies come down the line and it's worth the money to pull those panels down, recycle them, and put new panels out to create more electricity without a larger footprint, we didn't want to dissuade that. So that's kind of why we went with the square footage. So we've had a long discussion about it, and I'm glad to hear other people are thinking about that as well.
I think the voters too, you know, the lay people in the public who haven't thought about this a lot, 20,000 square feet means a lot more than saying an 80 kilowatt system. I mean, you know exactly what an 80 kilowatt system land use would take.
Right.
But you know that a megawatt system is gonna take 5 to 6 acres.
But I can visualize half a football field.
But people in the public who haven't thought about this a lot would want, the size is a sort of a concrete, they have more of a concrete understanding of what it's gonna look like than if we say, this is an 80 kilowatt system or a 100 kilowatt system, or, I mean, that doesn't mean anything to most people.
And that's one thing we get to, and I'll get to the comments here, but that's one thing we get to a lot in town, when we're talking about ordinances, is making them as understandable for the regular old citizens. So it's like if I'm reading a piece of, because like, someone came to our last board meeting, our last conservation commission meeting, said the industry talks in kilowatts and megawatts, not square footage. And the thing is like Michael just said, if I read an ordinance that says this allows up to a half acre development, that most of us can visualize that more than this allows 250 megawatts or
Yeah, I
don't
think
know.
that the acreage thing, everybody says, well, I have 5 acres, so this
Yeah.
would be that big on my land, this is
Yeah.
what that would look like. And I
Yeah.
agree with that.
'Cause-
The things kind of specifically that I thought were too restrictive in medium had to do with, some of the financial stuff and, yeah, some things like that, you know, for,
And what, we had a question,
Oh,
we had a
I'm
hand
sorry,
behind there,
yeah.
just name
Derek Lovich, Snow Road. Yeah, the size, I think, is a way to think about it, not kilowatts, because as you said, Joe, the increasing efficiency, it's gonna be outdated essentially as soon as it's passed if we're only limiting it by kilowatt hours. To have it as something that can be used down the line and not have to be readdressed with pretty much any future project, I think we do have to come to some determination about the footprint, and which I'll talk about later. I have some comments about that. But I did want to talk about something that's just come up, which especially where it gets a gray area of income. I have a rooftop solar system on a new house and only on my garage, built to maximize efficiency. I generate income from it because I sell carbon credits because I go beyond net metering. I'm certainly not a commercial solar farm, but anytime you get into generation and you get into whether or not it's just being used in the house, that would mean net metering 0 to 0. I would lose all that energy to CMP for free, which I have no interest in giving them. So that's just one of those kind of gray areas where it could, you know, whether if you're setting a standard of how much you generate, it could be a percentage of income. It's beer money for us, but you know, Jess knows that could add up. But yeah, it's just, there's grayer areas, in terms of something other than, there are fewer gray areas when we're talking about size. And I think.
So, to ask a question here,
Yeah.
is what you're getting at, let's say I put panels on every square inch of my house, even though and so now I'm just generating a bunch of, I'm not familiar with your program, but it sounds like you're generating extra for carbon. And so you're saying that could, are you concerned that could be a little bit more business use type at some point? Or are you concerned that it might say, hey, you now can't get that because you're making money there?
Yeah, it was just, I don't remember if it was a statement, a comment, or a clarification where it came up about generating income from solar. And I think we should be incentivizing, maximizing rooftop and things that don't have an impact. You can't see my house from the road, no one cares how many solar panels I have. But if you see a neighbor's house, you see their house regardless of solar panels. I think we should be incentivizing, maximizing how much we're getting from these existing structures. And
so-
income could be a limiting factor. I would've had to use fewer panels.
Yeah, I think to get to that is, right now, there is no language requiring anything other than the code enforcement officer permit for things that aren't rooftop. But I guess if you ran into a situation where you had over 2,000 square feet of rooftop, that might trigger the medium size at that point.
Yeah, that's sort of my concern is that, like, I
It
can
seems
put
like a lot of roof, but.
It would, but,
Yeah.
you know, if we're talking about putting it on, I think we wanna limit how much other stuff is being used up for these. And I think that's up to, I wanna make some comments about later.
I think you're right, I think we wanna encourage rooftop use, I think it's a
Right.
good,
It's already, it has the lowest
Yeah,
cost.
what you
there's
said earlier,
less
with like, well, they have to
infrastructure.
put more on the roof, I was like, sounds like a good idea, you know, like.
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
I
like,
think
Less cost.
our thought was that the 2,000 square foot would support a 40 kilowatt system, which is, you know, if the average rooftop is 8 kilowatts, it's still quite a bit of buffer for the average household.
Does the utilities and the power company have a set of dropping rules, lines, whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, categories.
In other words, your net billing is one house, one set of billing. You've got the solar farms that had originally had up to 10 people buying into them as a limit. That's probably changed by now, but are there the stuff coming down from the top,
I don't have a good answer
definitions
for that.
that we need to consider?
I mean, my understanding is you can put rooftop solar in your house and use it for multiple residents, use the credits for multiple
Yeah.
residents.
That's true. And it's anywhere in CMP's system,
That's
if
my-
you're in
that's-
CMP.
That's my understanding.
But yeah, that would just be sorry for interrupting,
No,
that
you're
would just
fine.
be a code officer thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Rooftop, period.
Yes.
And so that is
Yes,
kind of
we
the big
wanna
thing, we
encourage
want
that.
that to be, it's like, if you wanna fill your roof with panels, as long as the code enforcement officer says your house isn't gonna collapse and you've got the electrical capacity and, CMP will probably want you to have the right size transformer or whatever on your pole, that's fine, like, we wanted this to incentivize, but also,
But if you have a large barn
yeah,
and it's more than 2,000 square feet,
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, what about the
Medium.
school, like if the
Yeah.
school
Yeah.
decides to
Yeah.
put.
and so that's, I
So-
think that's where, I understand the question there is like,
so maybe
someone wants to-
rooftop is
Yeah.
different,
It's
period.
down.
and there could be we could explore some language there for if you're fixing it to an existing structure,
Right.
if there's an exemption. Yeah, cause, I don't wanna tell someone stop putting panels on your roof, cause it's like,
And again, none of this says you can't do it.
yeah.
It just says,
Right.
you have to go to the planning board
Right.
for conditional use and or site plan review.
Well,
But
but
it
it's
sounds
also,
like
it's
the-
not just that, it's a lot of those financial requirements.
Yeah, it sounds like your
Sure.
feedback is that if it's really easy to put it on your roof, we should make sure that it's still easy to put on your roof if you have over 2,000 square feet of roof.
Yes.
And which I totally.
Both
understand.
space and income.
Yeah.
And so my point was on the income level, cause even if you mention if there's any income from it, you could,
So
you know.
that might have been a misspeak.
We don't have any
by me.
language.
No, that's fine, I
There's
just
no
wanted to
language.
clarify that
That
and
might
make
have
sure
been
that.
me misspeaking when I was
I don't-
talking about income generating, that was probably the wrong nomenclature used there, but thanks for
I'm not,
catching that.
yeah, I'm not pointing fingers on it.
Oh, no,
but
that's
because it
fine,
was
you can
brought
point
up.
fingers right at me, I encourage it, I point fingers at myself.
Why don't we just like get rid of just say rooftop, like, no other limits,
Well,
right?
what if people can't put it on the rooftop because
Yeah.
they're on the south facing house, and they need to
Yeah.
have.
No,
So
no,
the
no, what I'm
ground-based,
saying
the
is-
ground-based
So-
has to be part of it.
I think what you're saying, Juliet, is you would still allow for the people to do a residential solar development for their home and business on, the fixed arrays on the ground or the trackers, like we see it, like, in Audubon and stuff like that. But we could also then still say there is an exemption for rooftop if you're exceeding two
That's what I
thousand
mean,
square
like
foot.
rooftop period is exempt.
Or
The-
it's category one,
Mhm.
it's
Or,
small.
yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, or treat all rooftop installations as a small,
But what if it's ground-based, because the roof can't support it, how big can it be? I mean,
I think that would just then be back into the 2,000 square feet.
but so if you have a bigger
Or
roof, you
less.
can put more in your roof, but if you don't have a good roof, you can't,
But it's
we're
the
treating
impact,
people,
right?
Yeah.
treating people differently.
Well, I
The
think,
2,000 square
I
feet
think
of
over,
trackers has a much bigger visual and other impact than 2,000
Yeah.
square feet on
It's
the
true.
roof.
and
It's
I would
true.
also wonder how much how much people have over 2,000 square feet of roof. I don't think that's gonna be a huge thing, but I think
Maybe
it's
just
still,
a
and it's still a good thing to ask, cause, you see some sprawling old chicken barns and
Exactly, that's what I was
houses
thinking.
and barns and this and that,
So if the goal is to
understand.
maintain the rural character,
Yeah, we
Yeah.
wanna encourage that.
roofs,
Yeah,
Yes, I agree.
Mhm.
yeah, so I think that we'll definitely have to discuss like a rooftop exemption there for anyone who has that
If
much.
it's ground-based,
Yeah.
put a limit in to be evaluated,
Mhm.
subject to the visual and all the other stuff.
So
We've got a lot of
Brunswick,
blocking things in there to work with.
Mhm.
Brunswick, treats rooftop as basically like the lowest, like, you don't have to get, special approval. It's really like, what we're talking about, they talk about as ground-based, and then they have these rules. I think that it would be great to be consistent with neighboring municipalities, and Brunswick does have their like next step up from small, start at a quarter acre.
Mhm.
And so you don't have to, under a quarter acre, you don't have to get the major development review, you don't have to
Mhm.
get the, visual, like, professional.
Yeah. George, could you go back a few seconds, cause I have a clarification question.
You're talking about the visual?
Can you go back to like our small, medium, and large?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And so what you're saying in Brunswick is everything, you said quarter acre, so that would say that everything up to 10,000 square feet is treated as a code enforcement officer type thing, so the same as a rooftop array?
It's, all you need is a building permit and electrical permit. It's treated, the permit is, the new construction residential, that's what you need for a building permit. And they talk about like what other zoning, things apply to it within their ordinance. But it's not 100-foot setbacks from roads, and it's not like a professional, vegetation person doing a simulated.
Yeah, a couple differences between Durham and some of these other communities like Topsom is they have industrial areas of those. So a lot of their regulations are recognizing
Yeah.
not just the size, but also the types of, settings that they're gonna be placed in.
Exactly.
Durham has none of that anywhere.
And so I'm noting that feedback for sure, but when we were thinking about this, we were thinking about the fact that it's like, we don't have an industrial zone, we don't have a downtown, like, it's agriculture.
This is in ag
forest.
zone.
Get goes downtown.
Besides a get and go, yeah, maybe we need a get and go zone, right? No, okay.
I'm
But
talking
so-
about the rules within ag zone
Okay, so
parcels. in
that's you're saying it still qualifies within, in that, with Brunswick?
Yep.
Okay. Look at that, so, it's good feedback, I appreciate it. Yeah.
So when we say 20,000 square feet or 2,000, we're talking ground mount, we're talking the impact,
That's right.
right? So tree clearing, if any, panels, fence, access road, all of that is part of that 20,000 square feet, or 2,000, whatever.
No, not part of that. Only the panels,
Yeah, the
Right.
footprint of the panel from essentially like the drip edge, so.
not the areas between them or around them.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that's different than Brunswick, cause they count the aisles between the panels.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like you're measuring, like the panel's angled at this, you're measuring from the back of the panel to the ground and then the front of the panel to the ground. And
Frankly, I
that's,
think that's weird.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't,
I think that's weird.
That's fair, yeah.
I think that's weird. I mean, I think if you're taking up a certain amount of area with your panels, that's the area.
that's your impact, if you're
Not,
clearing trees.
not because your panels are like this or like this, and that changes how many panels you can have.
That's what we're doing, we're going straight
I
down,
I
just
know,
flat.
I understand that, and I'm saying I think that's weird.
I do too, I.
So, so what you're advocating for is, if, sorry to interject, but I just wanna make sure I understand. So if we're saying, let's just say a whole number, it's a 1 acre, footprint.
Correct.
What you're advocating for is that should be from fence line to fence
No,
line
not
within the
fence
road,
line.
or,
Where the panels, in other words, when you go from the edge of this panel to the edge of the
so
back.
counting the clear
counting
space in
the clear
between.
spaces and the aisles.
The inverters, the aisles.
Yeah, because that's part of the, you know, that, in other words, that's what makes the impact, is the amount of space they take up on the landscape.
But the balance of that, these thresholds are pretty low. So, we're not trying to penalize by saying, oh, in the space between those has to be included in the 2,000 square feet or the 20,000 square feet. So, that was kind of, we felt more comfortable putting these lower because we're not
Have you
just.
seen other ordinances that only count the panel space?
Yes, yeah, that's what Thompson did.
Yeah, and so that's where we get this from, and so I wanna get to your question or comment next, Juliet, but like, so where I think about this is thinking about that panel footprint and not punishing, I don't know if I should use the word punish, but not counting the space in between panels, is that, you know, when you start getting to that, let's say, housing development level, where they might not have a really convenient way to just lay the panels all out in rows or stuff like that, and you get to like a cluster here and maybe a cluster there, and you start getting with that big wide space in between, they're not really necessarily impacting that, it's kind of the thought process there. So that's where you're thinking more of like the square footage of panels, but I understand what you're saying, is that it might feel funky. We went, this was, you know, we looked to Topsom a fair amount because they had developed a really robust ordinance that has been kind of a framework for a lot of other ordinances in the region, and it's kind of been propped up throughout the state as like a successful ordinance, so that's kind of where we got that information, but, you know, we're here to hear the Durham voice too, so. And Juliet, you had your hand up.
So that makes sense for 2,000 square feet projects, then you can fit a lot more if that's how you measure it, right?
Yeah, it's a lot.
So that
This
could be
means
bigger, it's not gonna be a tenth, whatever it is of an acre, it's gonna
20
be bigger
feet
than that.
wide and
as far
100
as
feet
the
long,
size.
you know, right?
So when you're driving down the road and
It's a
you're
lot of
looking at
roof space.
something, yeah, and so like, in my opinion, a project, a solar project is the total size of that project,
Mhm.
that's the impact.
Mhm.
Visually, clearing trees, grading, decommissioning,
Mm-hmm.
all of that is looked at that entire project.
And so, where I get a little bit caught in the weeds here is that, like, so if I have a road that comes in and I left a 100-foot buffer of woods and then the array is behind there, but I put a fence around that wooden, I put a fence starting at the beginning of my road, are you now saying, well, we don't count from fence to fence, but we count from clearing to clearing, but what if they didn't have to clear anything? Because it was a field on the backside of that wood line, so that's kind of where we were thinking about the panel square footage being the important part there, you know?
Well, so the fence should only, a good developer won't include any unused space in their
Mhm.
fence, that'd be safe.
Mhm.
There should be only like 10 to 20 feet
Mhm.
between the fence and the panels.
Mhm.
So you shouldn't have that sort of
Mhm.
issue.
Okay, yeah.
And a lot of times you're gonna have to clear trees around the edge because of shading
Shading,
issues,
yeah.
so there's
I
that
can
too.
understand if you're gonna call something a footprint,
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And also
it's
like,
everything in there.
it would be really hard to measure sort of that too, if we're just talking the panels,
Well,
like.
so we do know it's working though, cause Topsom uses it, and so they're figuring it out, so it might be worth having the people from their energy committee and their conservation commission or planning board come back to us or at least get an email from them or something like that to explain, cause like they're successfully, it's working there, and the developers are figuring out how to make it work, so.
Well, I think the developers are probably liking it more
Yeah.
that way, yeah.
So
I
this
think-
is, just to explain, this is a diagram that shows how you are gonna apply and calculate the surface area. So it's basically the footprint under the panel, not the surface area of the panel. That, you can measure that.
And if it's a tracker, then it's wider.
Once you
Yeah.
get the trackers though, you're into the large anyway, like those start at
Oh.
1 megawatt. Well, I guess, yeah, the
If
dual
we're
axis
doing
one.
it this way,
9 panels or
then
something.
it doesn't, well, if it's tracker, then you would be counting the space in between, right?
Well, if it's a tracker, you would probably count it at the widest, which is when it's flat, you know?
Which could be,
And so,
yeah.
and I guess to like your point about the space in between being used for agrivoltaics or whatever, this could be set up in a way using our language to say, well, they're actually gonna space it a bunch apart for that space for cropping, row crops or grazing or anything like that in between. It doesn't get to the 15-foot question, which we're gonna have to discuss a little bit more there, but,
I think the difference between whether it includes the aisles or not is kind of moot though, because the categories are so small,
Mhm.
and you know, when I'm looking at this from what I do on a day-to-day, and so I just think there either needs to be a fourth category added and just treat like the largest two categories in the way that you're treating medium and
Mhm.
large, or adjust these a decent amount.
yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, admittedly, what we're saying is that almost everything utility scale is gonna be bumped into the large category. And that's kind of how it's designed. And what I'm hearing for the feedback there is what you're saying is that maybe adjust that and then add an
And
even larger
there's another
scale.
philosophical difference for the town of Durham in its zoning from Brunswick, Topsom, most other
Our two
communities.
zones.
And that is, yeah, there's no commercial zones in this town. And so you can put a commercial use anywhere within the community if you meet the conditional use criteria. So what that has done is people are very sensitive to what goes in beside them. So it's gonna be a little bit potentially more sensitive here than in Brunswick, where you have zoning, it says you buy into this area, you know
Yeah.
what you're getting. Here, you can get anything anywhere, and that's why this town has historically put virtually everything through the planning board, other than a single-family dwelling.
Yeah, and I think that another thing with the zoning differences is just the the expectation for a rural community is that, you know, folks drive around the entire town and it feels like it has a pretty similar look and feel, you know, 136, 125 are a little bit more congested, but so there, at least, it feels like from most of the feedback we get from the community is like there's that expectation to always have your visual area occupied primarily by green space or agriculture or single-use family homes. And so I feel like in some of the surrounding communities that are more developed, Thompson, Brunswick, Freeport, folks have the understanding that there's already development popped up throughout town because of those zones, so there's just a bit of a different expectation based off of like what we got for feedback from the comprehensive plan and stuff like that. So, but I hear what you're saying, for sure.
We didn't specifically mention it, but, the ordinance would prohibit solar, medium and large solar arrays in resource protection areas.
Yes.
That's the only zoning that we have.
What about aquifers? Doesn't matter.
No. So the only stipulation we put in is that resource protection, no medium
Mhm.
or large. Otherwise, it's catcher's catch can, you know, you can
Mhm.
put it anywhere at this point.
I got one more thing to add.
Yes, please.
I think other people have mentioned this, but adding like a fourth tier, like larger scale, and increasing the setbacks,
Mhm.
like was mentioned, I think maybe 400 feet or so, maybe, or maybe not that much, sorry, I'm thinking of something else. But increasing the setbacks, increasing the height of the panels, I personally think 15 feet is okay.
What
for-
is large scale for you though?
Like, well, I
Sounds
mean,
like you're talking super large.
yeah, and so we can, like,
Above 20 acres probably would be my,
that's only about 4 megawatt. I would say more like 100 acres or something, but maybe that's not.
And so the pushback I will give there is from a lot of feedback I get in Durham, I mean, we all live here, but would be that like, 100 acres seems like a pretty large impact to be the minimum
Yeah.
threshold for large. 20 acres, you figure 20 football fields cleared and developed, seems like a pretty, that seems large in itself right there, so.
Yeah, I was just adding something because right now, our large, like a utility scale can come in and have the same 100-foot buffer
Mhm.
and
Like what you were saying,
right.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
as
like
a
add
unit.
something, whatever that is, but,
So maybe at a fourth scale,
With a
additional
bigger
buffer.
buffer.
In excess of
Yeah.
whatever that is,
something or other.
Yeah,
Need
I see what
to-
you're saying is that.
Need to
based
come
on-
back to.
Based
full
off our
base again.
standards, if you're a half acre or you're 120 acres, it's 100-foot buffer,
Exactly.
yeah.
What did South Portland put in? Where they're doing their whole city? How big an area did they choose?
I'm not
How
sure.
big is big in this?
Admittedly, we don't often look towards like the Portlands or the Auburns or stuff like that when we're developing our ordinances, we're mostly looking
But
at
this
Allen,
actually
Brunswick,
could.
Freeport, yeah, so.
It's a
But it's a good
If
question.
the transmission lines are there, you can go big.
Mhm.
exactly.
If you don't have the transmission lines, they're so expensive and exorbitant to put in that you won't.
Yeah, well, and that's part of what drove this discussion is that I believe that there are portions of Durham that have the big, what is it, 3-phase or whatever transmission.
34.5.
Yeah, the transmission lines that could accommodate the monstrously large, I guess that, I shouldn't use that negative adjective. The larger projects, you know.
And how many acres is that? We gotta figure that out.
Yeah,
well, that's.
well,
right.
Durham, it's a half acre.
Yeah,
you know.
right,
And again, this doesn't say you can't do it, it just
Right.
says you have to go to the planning.
right, per the state, or
Mhm.
per the.
And so George, if something goes to the planning board under this, if this language were to be adopted, and something to the tune of 100-acre development goes to the planning board, is the planning board then just tied into that 100-foot buffer, or is that when they start saying, well, the landscape architect is building a case to us and we're deciding whether that is
Well, first thing is for anything 100 acres, you're gonna be having a lot of discussion at the conditional use review stage, because the standard that they have to meet is the planning board has to make a determination that this thing is within the scale and intensity of use of the surrounding uses.
Mhm.
So there may be a place along the power line where there's nothing around it, and it's isolated, and even then, there's gonna be some neighbors on the roads leading to it, they're gonna be talking about it, so the planning board will first have to say, does this really fit? And I'm skeptical that a 100-acre, solar farm is gonna be very hard to meet that standard in this town, just based on what I've seen.
Big
But-
farm field,
But if we have this policy
Yeah.
and it doesn't have any limits, then I think that could be a hard argument. For if a
So-
developer came in and said, hey, I'm following the large solar policy.
So it sounds like you're advocating for adding another policy.
Or
I guess
changing
we wouldn't
them
call
around.
it gargantuan, but we would just change the definition of large.
Yeah, and we were just talking, I think it might be smart to look at the utility or the state, I think they've got thresholds. I think you were mentioning that too a little earlier, I don't know what it is now, but 25, 30, 50,
That was like 25 acres.
No, it's not acres,
It
it's
goes by
megawatts.
megawatts.
Or meg-
It-
yeah,
They
25
just,
I think it might be like 20.
yeah, they just disallowed 5 acre, yeah.
There's 4 levels, basically.
Yeah.
That's on the, like, net billing, so like they do a 1, 2, 3, and 4, but they used to let you go up to 5 megawatts. The new state law, I think, dropped it down to 2 megawatts max. Once you're up to the big transmission lines though, you're like at a 50 megawatt project. There's kind of a gap in between where it's not really economic.
So it might be 50. But
it'd
that
be
might be
worth
too
finding
big.
out from them what they're,
Like, that's hundreds of acres.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's about 4 acres per.
definition.
And so, another thing about this policy is this, in many ways, this is, I feel like is trying to establish a basis for something on the books and kind of making sure that we have something in place. And so if in the future, the community wants to, feels like there's more concern about those very large development pressures or that sort of thing, and we wanna make additions to the policy, I think that's an option. But at this point, I think that the reason we crafted a policy of this scale is just to kind of prepare ourselves for what are the current pressures. I don't know what the developers knocking on the door of Durham were looking at. I don't think they were looking at 200 acre, 150 acre developments. I think they were more so looking at what we're seeing pop up in a lot of other municipalities. So admittedly, this policy is trying to capture that sort of thing and just put something on the books other than a $250 permit for a massive, yes, sir.
Jeff Tanilla on Cushing Road. Do we have any idea how much of our wiring in Durham is a 3-phase and even
I think
justifying?
there's a map that shows it.
Yeah, I would.
There's like a solar siting map someone developed that kind of shows you where all the 3-phase are and those sorts of things, so you can kind of get an idea as to whether this is where you should invest your time. I think I glanced at one point and remember seeing portions of Durham.
It's
kind
easy
of-
to tell.
Yeah.
It's the ones with the 3 wires, so there's the middle, and then there's the 2 outside ones, they're on a crossbar. All the other ones, if they're single phase, they're just on a pole,
Right.
and it's a.
So if it's a T, if it's a T pole, then
Yeah, although sometimes they'll put those in just to get it away from the tree.
yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
If there's 3 wires running down it,
But my question was, how often do we have those in Durham? I mean, are we spending a lot of time thinking about huge projects when it's just not gonna happen because we don't have the 3-phase lines in a lot of
Well,
places? I don't know.
running from the Quaker Meeting House all the way to Lisbon, that's all 3-phase. I don't know about the rest of
All the big towers,
Hmm?
all the big towers, wherever they go. If there's big farmland spreads underneath them, they're a possibility.
This was a map that CMP did for fire, safety, emergency. So they
It's not a town meeting without a paper map.
So this was emergency services, looking at those power lines, so that's where the power lines are.
Those are the
This is the
transmission.
transmission line
That's
here.
transmission line.
So then,
Yeah.
The
with
Oh,
all,
yeah, those are
all
all
whole
transition.
Yeah, we have transition.
So, yeah, the inquiries we've been getting,
They're right along this corridor.
So we need to figure out, suggestion is figure out how big
Is that
those
the
are.
substation?
Yeah,
But
over
see,
in
that's-
Pownell, yeah. And to be fair, this area in here does have a fair amount of resource protection. That is has a fair amount of resource protection zoning, so,
Right around pond.
yeah, from this whole portion of the town in this runaround pond area. So that area would be taken out of the discussion for development.
You know, I'll just real quick point out the kind of irony in the resource protection and like the want in the survey of environmental protection, you know, and then the retaining the rural character. I mean, rural means the low population, right? But if we're discouraging in any way renewable energy, that's gonna protect the environment, gonna protect our resources. What it isn't discouraging is housing. That's gonna, you know, raise the population with every house and is gonna decrease the rural character, I guess. So it's kind of, it's a
Yeah.
weird thing.
And so I think that that's part of the reason why we're trying to develop a ordinance as opposed to like a prohibition or just outright banning or whatever, is because I think that, at least from the Conservation Commission standpoint, we understand they're striking a balance to, everyone's gonna go home tonight and turn their light switch on. And that electricity has to come from somewhere, and you fall into the not in my backyard, like,
Yeah.
I'd rather not have a solar panel here, but I'm okay with a coal-fired plant getting fired up for my football game tonight, you know, so we understand that is a really serious discussion to have. And so I don't know if I have a good answer for you, but it's not like we're trying to come at this as like, you know, no. And then the other thing too is our comprehensive plan does talk about, maintaining like individual property rights too. So we do understand like people wanna be able to generate income from their property, that they might not wanna farm anymore. They might have a land resource that they wanna capture value from, and it shouldn't be, you know, a rule saying, well, no, we get to decide exactly what you do. So we're trying really hard to strike a balance there, cause it's like, I'm gonna turn the lights on tonight. And I get that. Darren?
Yeah, so a few comments, both big picture and more in depth. First, I'm new to Durham 2 years. It was in Pownell for 18 years. Let me applaud the town and Conservation Commission for being proactive about projects.
I just wanna make a note, public officials just got a compliment.
Yeah, so we start with that, butter you up, so, no. I do think I have found that since I moved here, I was on the Conservation Commission in Pownell for more than enough time, but I've been involved, seeing the town working a little more proactively, in general on topics like this, and that I do think the town is worth being applauded for, because when it comes to a project on the table, it's always the vocal minority that is gonna win that argument, because they're the ones dominating a council meeting or select board meeting. So I think this is really helpful. That doesn't mean I don't have criticisms of the plan, and I know we're in an early stage. Personally, just, you know, I think distributed solar is the most efficient, cheapest, least impactful way to generate energy at this time. I love what it looks like, because I know what it's doing at an impact that's much less than almost anything else we could do right now, especially locally. Whenever we're looking at, you know, utility scale, totally different, distributed energy, less impact, and also less cost and loss during transmission. I think, but that also means that removing things like forest cover and productive farmland to generate energy is problematic. That's hard to do because we do have property rights and we do have zoning, but I think reducing impacts of a project should be a priority.
We put that off for this April meeting because we thought we wanted to get something on the books, and we thought that if we have mitigation fees and we have restrictions on location, like you can't cut this woods down or you can't put your solar farm on prime farmland, that it might be more contentious and it might be more difficult to get it passed. But we recognize that that's an issue and we wanna come back.
I agree with that statement totally, but I think there's a more progressive way to look at it, which is incentivizing projects that are gonna be better for the town.
Yeah,
Right.
and so that's kind of a little bit what Michael was getting at, so we had a pretty long discussion about this, cause if we looked at Topsom, they essentially have like this mitigation fee system, which makes it so some areas where they might, maybe it's a brownfield, or maybe it's a landfill, or something like that, there's a monetary incentive to put there versus putting it on farmland or a project that involves clearing. And, in Durham, we have a lot of prime farmland soils, we have a lot of large undeveloped forest blocks that we're concerned about. But to Michael's point, that was adding in essentially these like pseudo zoning type ordinances on top of just getting footprint management language established. And so when we first brought that to the planning board, they were like, this kind of seems like we need to get some basic standards down first for, what are the electrical standards, what's the footprint, what's the impact, that sort of stuff. And then at the following year, explore options for how do you incentivize putting it on top of, contaminated soils versus how do you decentivize putting it on top of prime farmland, or, saying, is there an incentive to do a project in an area that doesn't require 150 acres of conversion of forest to that? So that's definitely on our radar. It's just, it's a lot. And frankly, it's like, it's like, we're a volunteer organization, we're dealing with, the planning board's already dealing with the affordable housing thing, which is very busy and contentious. So in an effort to make sure we try to get one portion right, we kind of carved this out first.
Okay.
With that, we have had those discussions, and we're gonna try to focus on that for a future year, because agree, like that's why the toe we dipped into that was trying to make the rooftop the best option, and then we can focus on those incentives for locations at a next year. We're just concerned, like Michael said, if we added in, hey, here's a new ordinance, and we're establishing these pseudo zones, and we're establishing an in lieu fee program, but we don't have an account for that to go to. It was just getting really messy really quick. But not that we don't want to get into it, it's just kind of we had to compartmentalize.
Yeah, we
this
were
year.
spending some time looking at the Topsom ordinance because they have mitigation fees, so a higher fee in locations that have higher value habitat. And that was something that really intrigued us, but we don't really, as this town doesn't have the mechanism right now to handle, like what would you do with the mitigation
Right.
fees? It might require a whole
And we
process
realized,
of developing a different ordinance for handling mitigation fees.
And we don't
Yes.
have any zoning in Durham, that's the big issue. In Topsom, they had zoning already established, and they had a rural zone and a industrial zone, and they could set those mitigation fees based on, the value of that land to conservation.
and when we get to the point where we wanted to start exploring that, we also realized that, we didn't have this framework ready to go of like, here's this outside of resource protection, here's what Durham values as a habitat or whatever. And we just didn't feel like there was enough time for us to have an adequate public participation process to say, how do we structure the prime development area versus the 3 times normal mitigation fee development area? We just didn't feel like we could get public input in that, and we didn't wanna just come here and say, hey, here's your new development zone that we made up without asking, so that's kind of why, that is on our radar though, so.
Yeah.
I know I said a lot of words, but I hope you understand.
I do, and I get that. I don't think it's always about setting up zones and laying out mitigation plans and payments. I think there is a way to encourage, if I'm a developer, and I was approached when I purchased land by a developer, just wasn't something we were looking to do at the time. It was, hey, this is how easy it's gonna be to do here, and that's great, because as soon as you make it easy, they'll become, you mentioned not making it too hard, and it depends what the town's goals are. There are ways to say, this is something that we want to encourage or not, and there is a way to sort of play with wording about trying to say, if you do this, we're gonna allow that. So maybe one of the ways to think about what I'm hearing a lot of the negative comments are, or the criticism, excuse me, are of the sizing. And that's such a, you know, the sizing, we're gonna have to come up with some arbitrary numbers. But there may be not, if it's this big, or if it's this big, this is the set of things we're going to encourage to let a developer look at where they wanna package it. And so maybe it's not just about footprint, but, cause, you know, one
But
thing I
also
wanna
about
comment
location,
on
yeah.
is footprint is not just fence line, it's not just solar panels, it's certainly not drip lines. Impact, especially from a community level, are infrastructure and distance to adequate lines. And we've seen too often development occur where it was easy, which is sort of behind that hill, but then we have a power line come over it that then needs a right of way through another neighbor who says no. I think two of the things that were really important to me were mentioned in there that I wanna reiterate as part of those things, that was the minimizing the impact outside the footprint, and that was the trying to make some notes here. The mention of shielding for light pollution. Light pollution impact goes far beyond boundaries of a project. Habitat fragmentation by power lines is just as much an issue, if not a greater one, because the overall footprint calculated from the edge into a forest is a bigger issue than an actual chunk of the forest taken out by solar panels. So I kept thinking about ways to sort of say, you know, I know what you're saying, that we have to sort of get something on the books, but I hate to see the thought being boxed into as if each project was operating in a vacuum, because it's not.
Yeah.
And I don't know the great way to do that, and I hear what you're saying about maybe that's the next step,
Yeah.
but I think we need to find a way to not operate each project in a vacuum with a yes or no vote on everything.
And I 100% understand what you're saying, because things that we had talked about, like Roberta had brought up, is like project location, like outside of the footprint, if this is in a large travel corridor connecting to unfragmented habitat types. So that project might only be an acre, but if it's now cutting off 250,000 acre parcels, and that's the only, and we know that there's a lot of wildlife going across the road there, that's problematic. We just didn't feel like we had the time to get a public conversation like what we're having now to adequately address those concerns. And so rather than saying, let's punt the entire discussion to next year, knowing that we already have people looking to develop, we said, well, let's just come up with something for footprint, come up with something for construction standards, and then say, but on the roof is always the best option. So totally hear what you're saying. It's just, we felt like that was gonna be a multiple town meeting, town input, survey type thing, and we just weren't gonna be able to get it done.
No,
but
I
yeah.
understand that part of it.
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying too about, you know, shielding for light pollution, not just for humans, but also for, you know, when they get moist and wet at night and it looks like good habitat to land on, or things like that, you know, those are all
Brown tail
things.
walls are attracted by I mean, there could be
Yeah.
very easy standards of lighting, not just shielding, but I'd like to see, temperature, warmer lights, reduce insect, accumulation, reduce bird disorientation. The warmer the light, the less likely it is to attract brown tail moths. I worked on with a team doing, trying to get the city of Bath to change lighting to reduce, and you know, we talked about all the great things, dark sky, birds, bats, and it all came down to the brighter the light, the whiter the light, the more brown tail moths are attracted to and concentrated. And so I think there's more to, you know, some of the things that we put in, that like shielding, I think that's a perfect example of something that should be, that I applaud you for, and I really wanna sort of reiterate the value, but I do think color and intensity of lights is important, because a lot of the things we don't think about, such as what happens beyond the surface area that's being lit, I'm forgetting the range of Kelvin that the warmer lights are less encouraging to brown tail moth in particular. Not that they aren't gonna be around because of it, but it does increase concentrations, which could be a real issue for a neighbor who has an allergy, for example.
Yeah, understand. Julia?
Yeah, usually we don't, or I'm a developer, we don't, include any lights for their projects. Like, so,
What kind of lighting is there for solar panels?
There can be, especially, for solar installations, very security lighting around entrances, gates. For the panel itself, not necessarily, But with some of the storage, facilities that I've seen, a lot of those need to be lighted for security reasons.
But we're not dealing with that now.
Well,
But
with
no, it's the
storage,
point,
we
I
are
guess.
Yeah.
talking about storage. And so, like, if we mentioned in there's already a line about shielded lighting.
It is.
It's already been in the presentation, it's already, I don't know the exact technical wording.
And I actually meant,
But-
I wonder if we could say something like minimize lighting, like this is just solar, so if needed, like something, I don't think it's needed.
Right, and if it's, I mean, we don't generally light panels, but there's other infrastructure that involves lighting, including roads, entry roads, transmission station, there are things involved with solar that involve lighting. Drive through panel and you can see infrastructure that has lights on it. And I think by being careful with some of the things we are requiring now, we can do some things that minimize impact. And again, lighting is a big impact outside of the footprint. If we're so what you've mentioned is that we have to focus right now on the footprint. I get that, and that makes sense, because the next step would be where that footprint lives.
Yeah.
But that footprint is not, that fence line doesn't draw a straight line up and the footprint ends.
Yeah.
And lighting is one of those. Additional infrastructure such as connection to the grid is another big aspect of it. Road access, those are all impacts. So I think those are important to consider with footprint. And I don't know how to do that with making a set standard. I'm just saying, I think we need to consider it.
No, I understand what you're saying, especially when you say like, okay, so it's on the back end of a field, but now you have a larger access road, you have longer lines, you have potentially more lights, like I definitely hear where you're coming from with that. So.
I don't have a proposal of how that's done, I just think it needs
But
to be
it's a good
considered.
observation.
Back to the slide, the generalized description of the
Oh,
language
yeah.
that we're working with now, does talk about limiting the light as well as shielding it.
Right, I think there should be a very specific, or there should be something about color and intensity. And it's usually done by Kelvin, and I don't remember it, but the warmer.
So what you're saying is there would be a standard written in there, so folks who are developing know that like there's a certain bulb that you're putting in that light as opposed to an LED or something like that.
They're LEDs, it's a certain range of color. The range of color has less impact beyond, it minimizes the footprint of the true footprint, not the.
Yeah,
measured
if
footprint.
you have any literature on that, feel free to send it our way too.
Yeah, I can find it.
That would be.
Joe, should we send an email to you?
I would say to the Conservation Commission. I would
Okay,
have
okay,
a
email?
group email.
You can
Yes.
send it to me and I'll forward it.
George, what's your email?
Chairperson.
Town planner
Lighting it.
at durham.gov. It's right on the town's website.
Thank you.
When's the next meeting? January 3rd?
The planning board is gonna meet on January 3rd. I'm
Yeah.
assuming you folks are gonna have one more meeting to try to finalize things.
End of December.
20th.
The 20th, yeah.
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 And those are all posted on the town calendar. The Conservation Commission meetings aren't recorded, we take notes, but they are open to the public. We're a little bit more informal. If folks show up for public comment, we kind of are like, hey, if you want to give some public comment, you raise your hand, we'll acknowledge you.
December 20th,
Yeah.
6:30.
Right here?
At the town
At the
office.
town office.
Yeah.
We also have an opening on the commission, if anyone's interested.
It is a lifetime appointment, so yeah. So it is 8:48. If there aren't any other pressing questions or anything like that, I think we could probably wrap up, especially knowing that there's other opportunities to participate. I do wanna say thank you a lot for participation today. I mean, I hope you all know I'm not just doodling to make it look like I'm taking notes. I've got a lot of notes here for consideration. Definitely a lot for us to discuss at our next meeting. But I mean, this sort of participation is really what, is the root of local, rural Maine democracy. So we really appreciate the insight from folks in the town. We're better as a collective than we are as individuals trying to work on something. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A compliment and applause at the It's not happening.